So on behalf of Family Life International of the UK, I have the honour to introduce the speakers today and to welcome you all to our meeting. Now this particular meeting, those of you that know something about the organisation, and I see many faces that I've been seeing for many years, faithful attenders and members. The Family Life International FLI, that's what the name means, Family Life International, and this is the UK branch of it, have organised and they have held such meetings, at least one such meeting, every year since the year 2004. And prior to that, as a branch of the Human Life International, we have held these meetings in the UK since 1996. So we've been going a very long time, and during those wonderful years, the Family Life organisation, under the direction and inspired leadership of predominantly the few Catholics in the UK that have been concerned with this, and also under the inspiration of the Clovis family, have provided us with an incredible banquet of richness. They have not only covered the basic fields in the pro-life movement, the fields that some other organisations cover, such as abortion, infanticide, test tube baby programs, euthanasia, and all of those, sex education and so forth, all of those issues. But as you see from their display here in front, they are Catholic in the widest sense of the word, bringing the Catholic view, in other words, the universal view, to this enormous struggle that we are now engaged in to defend human life. Now Saint John Paul II, in his great encyclical Evangelium Vitae, said that everyone, no exception, is obliged to be at the service of life. And then another great thing he said, at the heart of the gospel is the gospel of life. And so, dear friends, those of you who know the battle that we're in and understand it, just looking at the newspapers in the UK this last few days, this last week, this last month, you will see moral catastrophe after moral catastrophe displayed. And so, few as we are, so-called ineffective as we are, we must remember that alone, with the infinite power of Almighty God, we can overcome this culture of death. Alone. If God is with us, who can be against us? We know this. So, even though the sky is dark and seems to grow darker yet, and the waves become even more tumultuous, very much like tsunamis, sweeping all before it, sweeping all vestige of human dignity, the dignity that every human being is made in the image and likeness of Almighty God. So this organisation is unashamedly Catholic, and under the patronage of our Blessed Mother, Our Lady of Guadalupe, whose beautiful image you see here, and there another statue of our Blessed Lady, we would conclude these opening remarks reminding you of whose side we are on. So I have the great honour of introducing our speakers, but before that, may I just point out to you that all of the talks that will be given today will be available on audio CD at the end of this day. And you'll see from your program that it will be £5 per talk, one CD, or for the whole set, £20. The DVDs of this conference, which will be absolutely marvelous, as you will realize as the day goes on, will be available, but they'll only be available in July. Obviously, they have to be brought together. The other thing is point out a book that Father Clovis has written for our benefit and our exhortation. This is a biblical search for the church that Christ founded in these days of great confusion. The price of this is £10. So I introduce now, somewhat belatedly, our first speaker, who is the director of the Secretariat for Family and Life in St. Lucia, but we in Family Life International have him as our spiritual advisor and our pastor, not just in South Africa, in the UK, in New Zealand, in Australia, everywhere where Family Life International exists, he is our spiritual advisor. So, Father Clovis acquired his PhD in mathematics in London. Thereafter, he entered the Angelicum in Rome and was ordained by Pope John Paul II, now Saint John Paul II. He went on to study canon law. Father is the spiritual director of FLI's worldwide organization, has given numerous talks around the world. He's the author of many articles and has recently published this book, A Biblical Search for the Church that Christ Founded. Is a most well-known figure in single-handedly taking on the government in a fight against the legalisation of abortion on his island of St. Lucia in the West Indies. I would like to emphasize the word single-handed. Father Marx, our founder, used to say, cowards go in groups, the brave walk alone. Father, please, have the honor to introduce you.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Some 5 years ago, I gave a talk entitled The Imminent Struggle Between Church and State. And this year, I've realized that I made a mistake in that talk. It's not an imminent struggle, it's an immediate warfare between the church and the world, in particular between the church and the UN, the superstate. Hitler, I'm sure many of you would have read, made a famous statement: if you're going to lie, lie big, so that, because nobody would think you would tell an outrageous lie. A little lie, yes, but an outrageous lie, no. And this is in fact what we've seen this year. The UN has produced a document in which it attacks the church with what can be called blatant falsehoods, outright lies. And this is what I will be speaking about today. So my talk has been modified. Originally, it was on Our Lady and the Sign of the Times, but I've said the sign of the times, the imminent battle between the United Nations and the Catholic Church. This very week, on Monday, there was a new attack on the Vatican, which prompted this talk, when the United Nations Committee Against Torture made some allegations about the Catholic Church. Who chaired the meeting? Well, the chairman was Claudio Grossman. Who is he? He is a population and abortion activist. Population control and abortion. And he's been at this for a very long time. In fact, in 1994, he worked for the UN on strategies for reproductive rights to be respected in practice at local, national, and international levels. So he's someone who is very much aware of the situation in the world in regard to what is called reproductive rights. What is the heart of the attack, the essence of the attack? Well, the Holy See had to undergo for 2 hours a barrage of questions. The questions were posed by Felice Gaia and George Toguchi. And the questions they put came from the non-governmental organizations such as the Center for Reproductive Rights. We can suspect also that Planned Parenthood had some questions. And some of the questions, well, 2 of them are, we have received numerous allegations of intimidation of witnesses and the shifting of finances by the Holy See to avoid payment of compensation. We have received numerous allegations. That's what they said. We're not saying it's true or not, but already the seed is planted. Another. And they are troubled because of the Vatican's position seems to reflect an intention for a significant portion of the actions and omissions of Holy See officials to be excluded from consideration by this committee. In other words, the church is hiding something. We're not saying it is, but it seems to. The seed is planted. The information, for the most part, in as much as it is formal, official, comes from the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and various anti-Catholic NGOs, such as I mentioned, the Center for Reproductive Rights. And the accusation in Monday's meeting suggests that the Church's opposition to abortion amounts to psychological torture of women. Very strong words. So the Church is now being accused of psychologically torturing women because she forbids or disapproves of abortion. And then finally, the committee raised the spectre of clerical abuse, which had already been dealt with by the Committee on the Rights of the Child in February of this year. So they're rehashing the old clerical abuse, something that as Catholics we find very difficult to live down. So let's go back to the Committee for the Rights of the Child. This committee sat, and the Holy See again had to present its case. This happened on the 5th of February 2014. And in it, the Committee on the Rights of the Child accused the Church of, 1, not protecting children against predatory priests. So the Church didn't protect the children. Who's the Church, by the way? Second, that the Church was involved in a cover-up. Now remember, it is the Holy See that is present. The Holy See, as we all know, does not have total control over its bishops, let alone over its priests. Yet it is the Holy See that receives the blame of covering up. And thirdly, it demands that the Church change her laws and adopt a secular sexual morality on matters ranging from abortion to homosexuality. So that's the end game. The Church must change her laws and even Scripture to accommodate the new secular morality. If we start with the paedophile scandal, of which we are all rightfully ashamed. When this scandal first began to be unveiled, the American hierarchy, in consultation with the John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the City University of New York, approved a charter for the protection of children and young people. So the hierarchy immediately engaged the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The the John Jay produced a report in 2004, 10 years ago, and in the report there was a study of 10,667 allegations of sexual abuse against 4,392 priests, and the time between 1950 and 2002, so 52 years. From the investigation, from the study, the data was produced, and I've broken the data down, or at least I'm looking at two elements of the data. First, the victims, and secondly, the priest abusers. Regarding the victims, 81% of the victims were male, boys. The sexual abuse in the broader culture is mostly heterosexual. We shouldn't be surprised, because homosexuals make up only 4% of the population. And if they're going to be abusers throughout the society, we would expect most of it to be heterosexual. Therefore, we can deduce from this that the genesis of the priestly abuse in the church is of homosexual origin. That's clear. But that is, in fact, is being played down. Secondly, 78% of the victims were teenagers between the ages of 11 and 17. The UN regards any person under 18 to be a minor. So we find that more than 3/4 of the victims were adolescents. And so the offenders are not strictly speaking pedophiles. We can have a subcategory of ephebophiles. That is, people who are interested in adolescent children. 80% of the cases investigated were substantiated. 18 were unsubstantiated, and 2% were found to be false. Showing then that there is truth in the allegations. So we're not shying away from it, we're not denying it. We acknowledge that a great evil has been done. There were criminals at work in the church. The length of time of the victim's abuse, that also is very interesting. 38% of the cases of abuse occurred within a single year. So it might seem to be something in passing. 38%. 2 out of 5 nearly. 21% was between 1 and 2 years, a little more serious. 28% between 2 and 4 years. 10% between 5 and 9 years. So the victim between 5 and 9, the victims who suffered abuse between 5 and 9 years accounted for 10%. And over 10 years, 1%. When we look at the priest abusers, of the 4,392 priests who were accused, 4%, this turns out to be 4% of the 109,694 priests in active ministry. So we see that 4% of the priests are responsible for the shame that we feel. 56% of the priests had one allegation against them. So more than half were accused only of one offense, serious as that is. But when we look at it more closely, we see 27% had 2 or 3 allegations, 14% had 4 to 9 allegations, and 3% had 10 or more allegations against them. Now, it is this 3% that we can focus on, because the 3% account for 149 priests. So 149 priests had more than 10 allegations against them. What is interesting is that these 149 priests were responsible for more than 3,000 victims. Now you can see how skewed it becomes. We just have 149 priests, being responsible for so many victims, and the whole priesthood is tarnished. And the church itself is brought into disrepute. Allegations were substantiated in 42% of the priests accused, and unsubstantiated in another 19%. And nearly 298 priests and deacons were completely exonerated. When we look at the age range of the priests, 50% of the accused were 35 years of age or younger. So again, that tells us something about when they were ordained. And almost 70% were ordained just before 1970. So what was the contributing factor to all of this? Well, first of all, as most of us may know, up until the council, there was a very rigorous and careful screening of candidates for the priesthood before entry and during seminary training. During seminary training, if any two seminarians showed particular closeness in their relationship, that was grounds for suspicion. And the reason was because a priest had to be priest for everybody. He could not have special relationships. But after the council, all of that was rejected. Any and everybody was well, not anybody, but whoever showed an interest were welcomed into the seminary, and all the screening ceased. And the second contributing factor, as again we will well know, was in the 60s, there was dissent against Vatican teaching, church teaching, against authority, and against leadership. There was weak leadership during the 60s. So all of this were contributing factors to the scandal. The scandal broke, and the church then set about damage control. In fact, right now, it is so rigorous, it's tough being a priest, because once a priest appears in any diocese, he's under suspicion. When I go to the US, I have my fingerprints taken, photographs of my face, my eyes, and I'm weighed, how much I weigh, and so on. I have to sign a declaration. I'm not allowed to be alone with any child at any time, okay? Because of 4%. And this is quite hard considering that I've been in teaching since 1975 and I've always been with children. Yet now you're afraid even to touch a child, you know. Anyway, that aside. So any priest ministering in the US, for instance, now has to have police clearance, and even here in the UK. The church established guidelines and best practices for protecting children, and this is global. In 2005, that's the year Pope Benedict assumed office, a directive went out to, as the papers said, weed out gays from seminaries. And Pope Benedict passed this with the document Light of the World. It wasn't just a document, a suggestion. It was given bite. And Cardinal Loveda sent a letter to all the bishops and the seminaries outlining the new procedures for responding to abuse and for dealing with seminarians who had homosexual inclinations. The media went ballistic. The church has a witch hunt, it said, against homosexuals. Nonetheless, Pope Benedict weeded out as much as he could from the seminaries, but he also expelled some 400 priests from the priesthood. And of course, as we know, both Saint John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI apologized again and again and again to the victims and their families for the evils they had suffered at the hands of priests. And still, there are groups insisting that the church has not apologized enough. So this is the background. When we look at the report of the UN, that's for the rights of the child, it is a catalogue of errors, of myths and falsehoods. It shows ignorance of the church's record on abuse. In other words, the church did something about it. It misunderstands the nature of the church, and there is an attempt to impose an ideology of sexuality and gender on the church. So, for instance, just look at some examples. The UN claims that the Holy See has consistently placed the preservation of the reputation of the church and the protection of the perpetrators above the child's best interest. Whereas, in fact, the reality is, if that were true before 2000, 14 years ago, the opposite is now true. And the Vatican in particular has insisted that bishops follow the directives given. But the UN is interested in portraying the church as an unreformed institution. The UN claims that well-known child sex abusers have been transferred from parish to parish. Well, yes, that was true in the 70s and 80s, but it has not been the case since the 1990s, 20-something years ago. And yet, this year, they're bringing it up again as if it's still continuing. The UN claims the Holy See has established full jurisdiction over child abuse cases in 1962. Well, that's a half-truth. The church did do this for a particular kind of crime, soliciting in the confessional. And even in the state, there was no such crime. Again, the UN claims confidential proceedings provided for disciplinary measures which have allowed the vast majority, I'm quoting, of abusers to escape judicial proceedings in states where the abuses were committed. That's an outright falsehood. Before 1990, abusers were brought to neither the church courts nor to the civil courts. The church's method of proceeding is very clear. Let's take an example, a case of divorce or annulment. If a couple, married couple, think that the marriage is not valid and they want an annulment, they want to have the marriage annulled, or a declaration of annulment be given, what's the procedure? The first thing the church asks, well, reconciliation is not being possible. The first thing the church asks is, have a divorce. When the divorce has taken place, the civil effect, then the process for annulment begins. It is the same with a crime that's committed by a priest. The state takes charge. The priest is charged, tried, and so on. If he's found guilty, then the church court takes over and will decide on what punishment to give him as well. So the civil punishment takes place, whatever happens, and then the church follows. Yet that is not what the UN is saying. So we have an outright falsehood in this case. The UN claims that, quoting again, a code of silence was imposed on all members of the clergy under penalty of excommunication, resulting in cases of child sexual abuse hardly ever being reported to law enforcement authorities in countries where such crimes occurred. How many people have been excommunicated in the last 50 years? I can think of only 2, 3. Yet it says a penalty of excommunication on any priest who blew the whistle. And in fact, the UN has not answered how come, if this is true, there are hundreds of priests in prison right now, and some dioceses are bankrupt because of compensation being paid. The UN claims thousands of babies have been forcibly withdrawn from their mothers by members of Catholic congregations and subsequently placed in orphanages or given adoptive parents abroad, as in the case of the Magdalene laundries in Ireland. This is being said this year. If only last year, on February the 5th, 2013, the Macaulay's report on the Magdalene laundries established that the accusations made about the laundries is absolutely false. Pure fiction. And this fiction was created by a film entitled The Magdalene Sisters, produced by Peter Mullen in 2002. In the same way that John Cornwall wrote Hitler's Pope and immediately destroyed the reputation of Pius XII, everybody believes that Pius was anti-Semitic because of that novel. In the same way, this movie, The Magdalene Sisters, has destroyed the reputation of nuns in Ireland. And the UN is using this fiction. This is what's so amazing. When a formal investigation by the Irish government established it as false. We go on. The UN claims 30,000 women spent time in the Magdalene laundries. They were forced to remain there. They were imprisoned. Yet, the Macaulay's report says 10,012 women passed through the laundries from the time it was founded until it was closed in 1996. The average length of stay was 7 months. The women stayed voluntary, and 80% of the women left spent only less than 3 years there. So what's going on? We have, in fact, the United Nations attempting to impose its ideology on the Catholic Church. In the document that the Committee for the Rights of the Child produced, there are some 57 articles. I can only produce some of them here. The UN expressed concern that its convention does not take precedence over the Holy See's internal laws and regulations. Now, how would you like it if the UN's convention took precedence over British laws and regulations? We already have trouble with Europe. And you want the UN to do this? Yet this is what the UN is claiming. So the UN then is attempting to impose its ideology of gender and sexuality in contradiction to religious liberty. That's Article 12. Article 25. The UN is concerned that the Holy See's statements and declarations on homosexuality contribute to the social stigmatization of and violence against lesbians, gays, bisexuals, etc. Well, I think we also condemn false witness and murder and adultery, don't we? And theft, yeah. Does that contribute to stigmatization against these people and violence against them? But we know what the UN is up to. In Article 26, the Holy See fails to make full use of its moral authority to condemn all forms of harassment, discrimination, or violence against children based on their sexual orientation. The Church, as we know, condemns all forms of harassment, discrimination, or violence against all people, from the womb to natural death. We do not try to protect particular groups. Everybody is protected. The UN, however, has special groups. Article 27. the UN again complains, the Holy See promotes complementarity and equality in dignity between girls and boys. Yes, we do. And does not remove gender stereotypes from Catholic schools' textbooks. Well, that's because there is male and female complement each other. That's a biological fact. So what does the UN expect us to do? It expects us to change scripture, modify the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and amend the Code of Canon Law. By the way, when it comes to textbooks, does the diocese have any say in what textbooks are used in Catholic schools? No. So the Holy See, all the way in Rome, is supposed to. Article 27. The Holy See has consistently placed the preservation of the reputation of the Church and the protection of the perpetrators above children's best interests. That's simple. It is not the Holy See. Bishops, individual bishops perhaps, have done that, but from 1990 they have been addressing the problem. 1990 is 24 years ago. They've been addressing the problem. Abuses that, child sexual abuses that do occur now, occur in state agencies. And the newspapers
We're
right
back
in
with
the
more
UK
tonight
shown
on a
this.
deepening scandal involving one of the world's largest and most respected broadcasters, the BBC. 1 month after a legendary BBC host was accused of having a long history of child sex abuse, the top official of the BBC resigned this weekend. We get the latest tonight from NBC's Keir Simmons in London.
It is a British institution described today as in near meltdown.
A terrible crisis which is entirely self-inflicted.
The BBC, watched and trusted by millions, now overwhelmed by scandal, leading to the resignation this weekend of its Director General after just 54 days on the job. A broken broadcaster, its leaders admitted today.
If you're saying, does the BBC need a thorough, structural, radical overhaul, then absolutely it does.
For decades, one of the BBC's star hosts, the late Jimmy Savile.
It really is one of the most serious crises the BBC has ever faced.
There are continuing questions as well about the man who until a few months ago was the BBC's Director General and Editor-in-Chief, Mark Thompson. Tomorrow, he is scheduled to become the CEO of the New York Times. In a statement, Thompson said, "During my time, I never heard any allegations about Jimmy Savile." But NBC News has spoken to one journalist who says he informed Thompson's personal assistant about the claims.
I absolutely said that. I always felt it extraordinary that no senior people within the BBC, including Mark Thompson as Director General, ever addressed this issue.
The BBC disputes his claim, but admits the reporter did call Thompson's office.
And in parliaments, I believe. You heard someone called Cyril Smith? And yet this is being downplayed. Huh? Article 31. The Holy See continues to view the rights of the child enshrined in Article 12 of the Convention as undermining the rights and duties of parents. Yes, the Holy See recognizes the rights of parents in regard to their children. The UN, however, ignores the right of the child to life by putting the parents' rights above the life of the child, which is what abortion is. The UN continues, the children of Catholic priests do not know their father's identity, and the mothers can only obtain church support if they agree on non-disclosure. So the children, basically the UN is saying the children should know who their fathers are. I agree. So sperm donors should not be anonymous, should they? And therefore anyone who donates sperm the child conceived should know who it is. And as it stands, sperm donors have no financial obligation to the children they father. The UN is asking for priests to have responsibility, so also should the sperm donor. He should have responsibility for the child he's fathered. And From our point of view, why should the church pay for the lusts of the individual priests? He should be the one paying for it, not all of you who contribute to the support of the church. The UN in Article 34 complains, the Holy See has not ensured that all children of Catholic priests know their fathers and that their fathers care for them. It should apply to everybody, of course, and in every country as well. Article 36. The Holy See does nothing to help children know their biological parents and siblings, so they're broadening the umbrella. Well, true, but it should also apply to sperm donors and egg donors. They should all know who their parents are and their siblings. The Holy See in Article 36b, the Holy See does not provide family planning, reproductive health, adequate counseling, and social support to prevent unplanned pregnancies. Guilty as charged. But then, which church does? In Article 39, corporal punishment, including ritual beating of children, has been and remains widespread in some Catholic institutions and reach endemic levels in certain countries. Have you ever heard of ritual beatings in the Catholic Church? Yeah? I don't know. I haven't.
Sounds like a ceremony.
Yes, yeah, a ceremony of some sort. Well, as far as corporal punishment goes, it is the state that decides on corporal punishment, whether it can be used or not. It's not the Holy See. Rome doesn't decide such a thing. And as far as I know, nowhere in its teachings is there such a thing that promotes ritual beatings. The UN doesn't give any examples. In some countries, some congregations. So throw the mud, dust it off as much as you like, it will stay. The stain will be there. In Article 40, the Holy See takes all appropriate measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence, and the UN urges the Holy See to explicitly oppose all corporal punishment in child rearing, in the same way it opposes torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Well, it's like asking the question, do you still beat your wife? Answer yes or no. The UN promotes and funds the killing of the unborn. That's okay. You can torture the unborn, rip the child out of the womb. That's okay. The church, as we know, does not promote or fund any form of violence against children. Article 41. The UN complains, in spite of its considerable influence on Catholic families, the Holy See has still not adopted a comprehensive strategy to prevent abuse and neglect in the home. I suppose we're also responsible for the abuse in non-Catholic homes. Anyway, our response, Catholic thinking and policies significantly reduces abuse, violence, and poverty. If we live the Catholic life as the Church teaches it, we'll avoid these three horsemen. It is well established and uncontested that children of marriages and family life, as promoted by the Church, flourish, experience statistically less violence, abuse, and poverty, that they are better informed and are spiritually, psychologically, socially, educationally, and materially better off than the children raised in the family models produced and promoted by the UN. Science has shown this. Article 44. The Holy See has not ensured the transparent sharing of all archives which can be used to uphold the abusers accountable, as well as all those who conceal their crimes, knowingly placing offenders in contact with children. We've dealt with that before. It's just the same question coming up in different clothing. Well, let's look at the UN. The UN peacekeepers have been accused of sex abuse, including the rape of minors. But the UN releases only generic statistics. No names, no countries, no time frames on these violations. Between 2007 and 2013, 600 allegations of rape or sexual exploitation by UN peacekeepers were reported. But the offenders were simply sent back to their home countries, where in the majority of cases, they drop under the radar. 2 years ago, there was the UN peacekeepers in Haiti raped a young man. It was videoed on the camera, and of course it was circulated. When the complaint, there was a riot in Haiti because of this. What happened? The soldiers, the peacekeepers who were from Uruguay were simply shipped back to Uruguay. End of story. Never heard any more of it. Is that the same as a cover-up? I'm not sure. Again, in Article 49, the UN, the Church's canon law does not recognize the diversity of marriage settings. Sorry, the Church's canon law does not recognize the diversity of family settings. So, the UN requires the Church to change its doctrine and to recognize same-sex families. In Article 55, the Holy See has failed to review its position on abortion, true, which places obvious risks on the life and health of pregnant girls, and to amend Canon 1398 relating to abortion with a view to identifying circumstances under which access to abortion services can be permitted. Well, that's a bit of audacity, isn't it? I mean, there's no hiding what the agenda is now. They want us to change our canon law so that we can say when abortions can be permitted. Well, we know when it can be permitted, never. The UN then wishes us to change our teaching on abortion, so that means the canon law, reject tradition, 2,000 years, and we have to reinterpret scripture. I think they're using the wrong church. Other churches might reinterpret scripture, but we can't, because that's what God gave us. Article 57, the Holy See has not done enough to overcome all barriers and taboos surrounding adolescent sexuality that hinder their access to sexual and reproductive information, including family planning and contraceptives, the dangers of early pregnancy, the prevention and treatment of sexually transmitted diseases and AIDS, HIV/AIDS. We haven't done enough. Well, the Church has told us what needs to be done. Abstinence and chastity will do that more effectively than contraceptives. The UN perceives sexual promiscuity as a right, and that the avoidance of STDs and HIV/AIDS requires protected sex instead of no sex before marriage and fidelity in marriage. They don't apply the same logic to cigarettes, alcohol, or drugs. 58. The UN complains that thousands of babies have been forcibly withdrawn from their mothers by members of Catholic congregations. Notice how it comes back again and again. And placed in orphanages or given to adoptive parents abroad, as was the case of the Magdalene laundries in Ireland. As I mentioned, a total fabrication. The Magdalene laundries were produced by Peter Mullen and has been discredited by the Macaulay's reports published on the 5th of February last year. What has been the effect of the attack? Well, it demonizes the Church. Throw enough mud and it will stick. It demoralizes the faithful, who are unable to counter or to explain away the accusations. So we are ashamed of what's happened and we have no response. We can only hang our heads. It undermines the church's authority and trust in the church, because we're suspicious now of priests. We're even more suspicious of bishops. And the church, however, over the past decade, 10 years, since Benedict became Pope, has defrocked 848 priests and sentenced another 2,572 to a lifetime of penance and prayer. Lifetime. We should be undergoing penance and prayer anyway, but they have to do this usually in a monastery, and even perhaps the penance is reduced in the case of priests who are elderly or infirm. So that is the effect. The reasons for the attack? Well, the Holy See, which constitutes the Vatican City, that's its territory, was given observer status at the UN in 1964. So that's 50 years ago. It does not have voting rights. It does not vote as other states do. But it does have influence. It can monitor what is going on in the UN. And there has been a move to withdraw this right from the church, because the church, of course, obstructs the works of the pro-boards and in the UN. So what does the church's work in the UN consist of? First of all, helping to ensure the right to life and the dignity of every human person. That's its main work at the UN. It obstructs the goals of the population control zealots at the UN, starting at the Cairo conference in 1994. The church has been able to block an international right to abortion. Because if abortion becomes an international right, then individual states who have signed on are obliged to make it part of their law. It has also been resisting the homosexual agenda. In fact, a UNESCO report decries that in many parts of the world, people remain intransient in their attitude towards homosexuality. So there's been a move to expel the church, and this began perhaps in 1999, and the reason given was because of the church's pro-life views. Guess who led this move? Catholics for a Free Choice. They called it Operation Sea Change, the intention to expel the Holy See. Of course, these moves failed because, interestingly, the church's support came from Muslim countries for the most part. Non-Christian countries. They recognized what was at stake. And so this year, I believe what we're seeing is payback time. The UN thinks it's strong enough now to be able to drive the church out and to take charge. So we are living in critical times. We are facing not a battle between church and state, but the church and the world. And therefore, Our Lady of Fatima is critical to this. On Tuesday, next Tuesday, the 13th of May, we'll again recall Our Lady first appeared at Fatima. On Monday, day after tomorrow, Monday the 12th of May, the University of Harvard, you've heard of it, are going to host a Black Mass. They haven't said whether they said they're not sure if they're going to use consecrated or unconsecrated hosts. But in freedom of religion, there will be a Black Mass. A strange date to choose? I think not. The battle is warming up. So then, what can we and should we do? Well, first, we must pray for the church. Pray for the Pope, pray for our bishops, pray for the priests. Individually, we must live the gospel faithfully and make use of the sacraments. When Catholics are in a state of sin, the church is weak. When we are in a state of grace, the church is strong. So we have to start thinking of things like the sacrilegious communions that are being made, and so on. We need to inform ourselves of the issues at stake, which is what this conference is about. We need to be skeptical and suspicious of media reports on the church. It doesn't mean that they're false, but it means there's an agenda. So we need to be able to discern what is the truth. We need to pass on the Catholic worldview to our children. That means we must be informed and we must be able to transmit this information, this knowledge, to the next generation. We also need to be aware of the violations committed by the UN and other states, and the military of other states. So, as I mentioned, 2011, a Times article said hundreds of Haitians protested in support of a teenage boy who said he was sexually assaulted by peacekeepers from Uruguay, sorry, I said Ecuador before, it's Uruguay, on a United Nations base, eliciting a furious rebuke from Haiti's president and an apology from Uruguay. Notice what the newspaper said. He said he was abused, but there were videos of it. But the Times is trying to keep it under the radar. 2005, the Christian Science Monitor said, wherever the UN has established operations in recent years, various violations of women seem to follow. We need also to be familiar with the work of Amnesty International when it gives reports on the violation of human rights. Amnesty is not necessarily sympathetic to our view, but they do work in regard to human rights, so we should be able to keep track of what they say in that regard. We need to be conscious of news reports. Did you know, or do you remember, that the president of Nigeria, his official visit to Canada was cancelled, the invitation withdrawn, because he supported an anti-sodomy law in Nigeria. So, notice again, the agenda is at work. What about Jimmy Savile? Is the BBC going to pay compensation? What about Cyril Smith? These are issues that we can take up, and the same standards, demands of the church should apply right through. Everybody should be subject to the same law, because we are equal, are we not? The Home Office, notice, if we look back at history, the Home Office gave some very good advice in regard to the Mau Mau, who were being tortured. They were, in fact, the men were being castrated. And what did the Home Office say? If you sin, sin quietly. We have President Obama threatening Uganda if they pass the law against homosexuality. Abu Ghraib in the prison in Iraq, remember the images from there? The US doesn't have to apologize again and again and again, does it? But we do. If we look at statistics, and that's always a good thing to look at, 4% of the US is homosexual. Yet, what is the percentage of people suffering from HIV/AIDS? 50% of them are men who have sex with men. But homosexual only 4%. Yet they account for half of the people affected by HIV/AIDS. What about China's policy, one-child policy in human rights? We take that as, oh, well, okay, it's China, it's a long way away. But it should be an issue for us. If the president of Nigeria can be prevented from going to Canada, then the Chinese shouldn't be coming here. Because what's worse, to forbid homosexuality or to kill children forcibly, against the mother's wish, against the father's will? Which is the worst? The Tuskegee experiment is something else, where from 1930 to 1980, some 50 years, human beings, the black Americans were used in an experiment of syphilis, to see what syphilis does in its final stages. They were not treated. When finally the story broke, President Clinton apologized and gave compensation to the survivors, $10,000, for a lifetime of syphilis and all of the damage it does. These are the facts that we should know, and we should be able to respond. We shouldn't take it lying down. If the church is attacked, aren't we confirmed? We're soldiers of Jesus Christ. Let us then, as soldiers, fight, and fight under the banner of Our Lady of Fatima. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Thank you very, very much, Father. Father, are you prepared if there are any questions?
You said basically, how do we transmit the worldview when contraception is changing the society? Yeah. Okay. The Catholic worldview is very clear in the teachings of the Church. So when we look at the question of contraception, that's been dealt with. Casti Connubii, Pius the 11th, Paul the 6th, and John Paul the 2nd. Okay, so that is our position on contraception. Let us look and see what it actually does. Only this week, yesterday to be exact, a very interesting clip on YouTube about contraception. It says because the water, our water is contaminated by estrogen. Okay, what is happening to nature? First of all, it says fish are becoming transsexuals. There's a change in gender. So the male fish are becoming female. It's happening to birds as well. Okay, and this is clear. And they can no longer reproduce. So if it's happening to the fish and the birds, who's next? When you look at Genesis worldview, on the 4th day, God created the fish and the birds. On the 5th day, he created the mammals. So if it's happening to the birds and the fish, we're on the 4th day. In fact, we're coming into the 5th day. So we can expect this. So we can bring in science, we can bring in theology, we can bring in history, we can bring in tradition of the church. All of this, no one person can know everything, but each of us can use our particular expertise, our particular science, to apply it, and we can recreate the Catholic worldview and show that the modern view, the secular view, in fact, is inimical to the human beings.
Yes, sir.
Can our wonderful speaker look into the future and say one way or another if he thinks that in a future time, or perhaps closer, that our professed religious clergy could get taken out of circulation, incarcerated, or like the cardinals in China for many, many years, sort of practically they're dead, or get psychiatrically dealt with, locked up and given us chemical cosh.
Yeah. Yes, I think that is where we are going. The question was, can we see in the future, distant or immediate, where the clergy will be given a choice, and if they insist on teaching Catholic truth, they will be taken, put into gulags, or they will be dealt with psychologically. Yes, that happened during the French Revolution. It happened during the English Reformation. Yes, I see it happening.
Dear friends, I'm afraid that is all we have time for